welcome. I am thrilled to be here with all of you for AJC's signature Global Forum session, The Great Debate. This year, our topic is one that cuts to the core of our worries and fears, as well as our hopes and dreams for the Jewish community in this country. Our panelists will be debating the question, is the golden age of American Jewry over? The debate's central question asks us to consider the health and well-being of the American Jewish community in 2022. The 20th century saw enormous political and social gains for American Jews, with our community's remarkable mainstreaming into the fabric and fiber of American life. Indeed, many might say that American Jews helped define that fabric and fiber. Is our community now on the wane? Are we irrevocably divided, less Jewishly identified, and no longer able to effectively flex our political, cultural, and social muscle? Or is our community adapting and changing to be able to meet the challenges that we face in these complicated times? We are privileged to be joined this morning by two esteemed thinkers and observers of the American Jewish community to debate this question. Dr. Pamela Nadell, Director of Jewish Studies and Patrick Clendenin Chair in Women's and Gender History at American University in Washington, D.C., and Bret Stephens, op-ed columnist at the New York Times and editor-in-chief of Sapir, a journal of Jewish conversations. Let's welcome our speakers. We're going to begin our debate by asking each speaker to offer an opening statement of up to 2 minutes. We will then allow up to 2 minutes of rebuttals, after which I will pose a series of questions to the debaters, who will have up to 2 minutes to respond. We will conclude with 1-minute summations by each debater. Based on a coin toss that we did in the green room, we're going to begin with Pam.
Thank you.
I want to just tell you before we begin, let's just put it this way, buckle up. This is not going to be a dry debate. Without further ado, Pam.
Thank you. It is such an honor to be here at the Global Forum's Great Debate with Bret Stephens, with Dr. Laura Shaw Frank, and I really want to thank David Harris for this provocative question. Golden ages tend to appear in retrospect when our own moment in time propels us to long for some kind of idyllic past. It was 19th century Jews, disappointed by the roadblocks that they faced, like the Dreyfus Affair, who glommed onto the idea of a golden age of Jews in the medieval Muslim world. Our golden age dates to after World War II, as American Jews, in the wake of the greatest disaster in all of Jewish history, ascended to unimaginable heights. Stunningly, Judaism, the faith of just 3% of the population of the United States, became one of the triumvirate of America's major faiths. Post-war prosperity propelled a synagogue building boom as the last descendants of the East European Jews climbed into the middle class. Anti-Semitism even seemed to decline when Gregory Peck, in Gentleman's Agreement, made it unfashionable on the silver screen. That era launched our golden age. And as this forum demonstrates with 1,000 of you in this audience, the signs of its vitality have not abated. The extraordinary energy of American Jewry is manifest in more than 9,500 Jewish communal organizations. Our population has grown 12% between 2013 and 2020. Then there is American Jewry's continuing religious vitality. In 1957, sociologist Nathan Glazer said of orthodoxy, there is little to say. Other than that, it has survived, barely. No one would say that today. But most importantly, this month, as we mark the Jubilee of women's ordination that brought thousands of women into our leadership in our community, there is no way that this golden age is over. now that 1/2 of the American Jewish people who had been written out of history are now making it.
Bret, we turn to you.
Well, the first thing I want to say is I hope I lose this debate. I'm a pessimist by nature, which means I'm Jewish despite my last name. 100 years ago, in June of 1922, the most important man in Germany was a Jew, Walter Rathenauer. 100 years ago in Germany, the winner of the Nobel Prize in Medicine, Otto Meyerhoff, was a Jew. 100 years ago in Germany, the most important philosopher of the German Academy, in fact, the most important philosopher of all of Europe, Edmund Husserl, was a Jew. Now, why do I mention this? Not to say that we are destined to move along the same trajectory. I say this because the history of the Jewish people in its diaspora has been a history of darkness at noon. At our zenith, we reached our precipice. And that is what I fear we may be confronting here in the United States today. What are the conditions in which Jewish life in alien civilizations has declined or has collapsed? There are 4 central points. One of them is when the politics of envy and resentment become the dominant strain of politics on either end of the political spectrum. The second is when ideologies of race become increasingly central to the ways in which the outside world, the non-Jewish world, perceives human distinction and sometimes perceives the Jews. The third is when habits of independence of mind, skepticism, activism, irreverence, irony, questioning, second-guessing are treated as heresies, not as vital contributions to a progressive civilization. And the final one is when conspiracy thinking goes mainstream. In Germany in the 1920s, there was a conspiracy theory known as the stab-in-the-back theory, which ultimately led to deadly consequences for the Jews. Today in America, we live in a land in which seemingly sane people think that 9/11 was an inside job, that Barack Obama was born in Kenya, that the election of 2020 was stolen from the incumbent president. When people will believe anything about anything, they will believe anything about the Jews. And that is what worries me today. Most of us in this room tonight will not go home to neighborhoods in Williamsburg or Jersey City where the rise in anti-Semitism creates a clear and present danger for the population. But most of you in this room have children or grandchildren in universities where the only acceptable bigotry is the anti-Semitism of our day, which is known as anti-Zionism.
Okay. I see we're not staying to our 2 minutes, but that's okay. We'll be a little flexible. Pam, your rebuttal.
There's, first of all, thank you so much for saying you hope that I'm going to win. So I'm really happy about that. And me too. I think it's really important for us to kind of have this long perspective. I'm a historian, and so I think that history informs our understanding of the present. And we are definitely in a moment where anti-Semitism, it's been all over this conference, it is roiling our community. Yet I think what we fail to understand is to what extent it has made relatively minimal impacts in the wider world. So you look at what's happening on the college campus. I spent a lot of time on college campuses. I spent a lot of time talking to college presidents, to university faculty, to people who are studying this issue. There are many, many terrible incidents on campus. No way that I'm not going to recognize that. However, over 90% of our 18-year-olds would not be going to colleges and universities if they were under siege from anti-Semitism all the time, because we as Jewish parents wouldn't be sending our children there. When they're in their STEM classes, when they're in their business school classes, when they are engaged with their friends in most activities, they are not confronting anti-Semitism on a day-to-day basis. And everyone I talk to says on the campus, the Hillel directors, that's the case day by day. Yes, there are terrible incidents, no question about it, and when they happen, like Mohammed El-Kurd's tour this spring, noted anti-Semite, was touring all around the major colleges, and committed Jewish faculty, committed Jewish studies faculty, and committed students stand up, and we go to our administrators and we tell them that they need to intervene. Sometimes they do. On my campus they did. He did not speak on campus, but at other places they don't. So we need to be vigilant, but that doesn't mean that the rising anti-Semitism is ending our golden age.
Can I just quickly make a point there? Because I think you're right. It's a little bit like cancel culture. What worries me about cancel culture aren't the instances of cancellation, right? So people get canceled and then they recover their careers for one reason. It's the culture. It's the culture. That is the fear that so many people have in different walks of life that if they speak up, they're going to be canceled, which leads to a culture of silencing. And my sense is, sure, the incidents that reach the headlines, that get the attention of the Jewish press or the major press, are relatively few and far between. Why? Because people are shutting up. 63% of students on college campuses, according to Heterodox Academy, believe that their campuses are places where they cannot speak freely. And I say this only anecdotally because data is hard to come by, but all of you who have children or grandchildren at colleges know that that goes doubly so when it comes to conversations about Israel, when it goes to talking about their Jewish pride, their Jewish identity, and their Jewish political affinities. And what's so frightening, and this is what really frightens me, which is that incidents which would be 5 alarm fires when they involved different ethnicities or different minorities are treated as trivialities when they involve Jews, except when a trustee gets involved or a philanthropic parent gets involved, and then it's sort of taken up. I'll give you one small example that I found so upsetting. After the anti-Semitic attacks of May of 2021 during the war, all of a sudden a few people got it in them to say, right, well, we oppose anti-Semitism. But all of these statements were couched in, we oppose transphobia, Islamophobia, this phobia, that phobia, anti-Semitism, and then 6 others, right? This is the same culture that says, no, Black lives matter, right? Let's focus on the hatred at hand. So notice the cultural double standard that when it comes to anti-Semitism, to denouncing anti-Semitism, administrators, teachers, and the culture at large speaks sotto voce. When it comes to other forms of bigotry, they are loud and insistent, and that's a telling difference.
Okay, but I would argue back that you're right. I mean, I've seen a lot of those statements, but I would argue back that especially in the wake of AJC and Hillel hosting university presidents to talk about anti-Semitism, that conversation is changing. I mean, I've seen signs of that conversation changing. So when we issued a statement condemning anti-Semitism on campus, because we'd had an issue where we had a Jewish student and a Muslim student plan a joint Pesach Iftar event, and the Muslim Student Association pulled out. The one I felt really badly for was that Muslim student who had planned it. We issued a statement opposing anti-Semitism, and we did not issue it under the rubric of all of these other things. So I think since May 2021, we are seeing the beginnings of a change. We are also seeing, and I talked to a lot of faculty who are involved with this, we are demanding that the diversity, equity, and inclusion programs on our campuses, that they introduce information about anti-Semitism and information about the Jewish people, that they've been ignoring that. You're absolutely right, but they are not going to continue to ignore it any longer.
Okay. We are going to return to the question of anti-Semitism in a few minutes. At this time, I want to turn to some questions about the Jewish community as a whole, and I'm going to start with a question about demography. The 2020 Pew Survey of Jewish Americans showed a community with a steadily shrinking center. American Jewry is becoming simultaneously more Orthodox and more unaffiliated. The once large conservative and reform movements are contracting. And among American Jews who have gotten married since 2010, 61% are intermarried. While the offspring of intermarriages have become increasingly likely to identify as Jewish in adulthood, still, this group remains far less affiliated and identified as a whole than the offspring of endogamous marriages. Does the picture of American Jewry from the Pew Survey depict a community with its best days behind it? Start with Bret.
Look, what you have is a Jewish community. Let me put it this way. There are, if my memory serves, there are 8.6 million Americans today, as best as we know, because surveys of the Jewish population are very imprecise, and you never know which Jewish children grow up to choose to be Jewish adults. But as best as we know from the survey data, there are 8.6 million Americans today who had a Jewish parent. There are 4.3 million Americans who actively affiliate with a denomination, conservative, Orthodox, or Reform, and who participate in some meaningful way as Jews. So other than simply saying, oh yes, my mom was Jewish, my dad was Jewish, that there's some meaningful content in their Jewish life. That's 4.3 million. This is a country that in my lifetime has grown from 211 million people to 320 million people. So essentially, or 330 million people, so essentially a third in the growth of demography, and yet the Jewish population has more or less remained stagnant, somewhere between 5 and 7 million. The more dismaying aspect of it is, it seems to me, is that American Jewry is losing its vital center of affiliated and committed Jews who are somewhere in the middle between orthodoxy and indifference. And so what you're looking at now is a picture of American Jewish life in which American Jews are either entering the mainstream of American life and often disappearing into the mainstream, or they're more identifiably Orthodox, which is a wonderful thing with one exception. It is the Orthodox community that increasingly bears the brunt of visible and virulent anti-Semitism. And because of that, the nature of Jewish life in America is increasingly going to look like Jewish life in France. Also, up until about 30 years ago, a vibrant and important community that is increasingly under threat, where every single communal institution has to live under armed guard. By the way, just look at the amount of security, not just here, but every shul, every day school, and how that's increased in the last several years. And ask yourself, don't you feel a bit like the lobster that's getting boiled in the pot?
Ooh.
Okay.
Pam.
So what's prompting the question is how critical it is for us to have a denomination in the center, right? That's really what we're getting at. We watched the conservative movement, which was the movement that rose as our golden age was born in the 50s. We watched it rise to be the largest movement, and now we've watched it decline. The question is, do we need a center, a denominational center, when we know so many Jews are not affiliating with the denominations, the way, by the way, the rest of the American population is also, if you ask them what their religion is, they answer none. So do we need a vital center for American Judaism to continue its golden age? And I actually think not. I think I'm not writing off the conservative movement. There are 1.25 million Jews in the conservative movement, and it will remain an important segment of American Jewry. But those 9,500 organizations that I mentioned, which was a figure that is guesstimated in 2010, so maybe there are more by now, maybe the decline of the center has allowed American Judaism to expand its range of opportunities and ways of identifying. And I'll name only two two new institutions that emerged, like Six and I, one of these a community center, but also an alternative congregation, and New York's Yeshivat Maharat, where Laura Shaw Frank used to work, and that there are scores of new Jewish institutions that have given voice to the American Jewish community, the museums, the podcasts. I would even mention your journals up here.
There's one bright spot.
Okay, the statistics point to a changing Jewish community, not the end of the Golden Age.
Okay. We hope you're right. Let's turn to the political realm. And Pam, we're going to start with you. Are Jews headed toward political irrelevance? We know from many studies of the Jewish community that a strong majority of Jews vote Democratic. Do Democratic candidates for office still court the Jewish vote? Or is it so assured that they don't even bother? And as for Republican candidates, have they written off the Jewish community other than the Orthodox, therefore not bothering to seek the Jewish vote either? And in addition to candidates not courting the Jewish vote, we know that fewer and fewer Jews take candidates' views on Israel into account when voting. How can Jews advocate for our needs and for the needs of Israel in such an atmosphere? Is the era of Jewish political influence behind us?
So I don't think the era of Jewish political influence is behind us. The great Orthodox decisor, Reb Moshe Feinstein, used to say that not only must Jews vote, but they must do so in ways that will do the most good for their community. The issue is that Jews differ on what is the most good for our community. So the Hasidim of Kiryas Yoel, who entered into politics as they battled in the courts for state support for education and for their schools in their town, differ very much in their agendas than an organization like Jewish Women's International, which works to combat domestic and sexual violence. But the point is the diversity of political opinions in the American Jewish community is nothing new. In 1790, when there were only 2,500 Jews in all of the United States, and you're about like half of the size of that total community back then, the Jewish community didn't send one letter to congratulate George Washington. They sent 3. You only know about the one that led to his famous quotation that this is a nation that gives to bigotry no sanction. My point is, Jews have different agendas, they have different ideas about what is for the good of the community, and they continue to exercise it, and that shouldn't surprise us in a community that has 7.5 million Jews today, by one count.
In 1790, there were 2,500 Jews and 5,000 opinions.
Now we got 15 million.
Look, I think there was a watershed moment about 2 years ago when a Democratic member of Congress made an unmistakably anti-Semitic comment, not for the first time, but for the third. And when an effort in Congress was made to reprimand her, that effort effectively failed. And that was a moment in time. There have been, and I don't think there ever will be, perhaps one absolute watershed moment after which we feel like everything's different. But again, there's something cumulative about this. There's something deeply worrying about the fact that so much of the Democratic Party, even if the numbers aren't quite there yet, is enthralled to a side of its, or a political side that is militantly hostile to Israel, that is in favor of BDS resolutions, that at a minimum wants to isolate Israel and distance itself from the country. Is that the majority of the Democratic Party today? No. But it's where a lot of the energy, a lot of the enthusiasm, and a lot of the youth in the party resides today. On the Republican side, you have a party that is increasingly giving vent to ideas which I think of as anti-Semitic adjacent. And these adjacencies to anti-Semitism sometimes worry me just as much as anti-Semitism itself. For instance, when you talk about a cabal of globalists who are interested in dissolving national borders for the sake of importing inexpensive foreign workers and replacing the native born, as Tucker Carlson does, as lots of Republicans now openly do. That's not explicitly anti-Semitic, but a guy like David Duke listens to that and says, I know exactly what you mean, you just haven't reached the right, you just haven't spoken the name of the real culprit in this so-called replacement theory. Or you have a party that, again, is giving itself over to the most illiberal instincts and anti-democratic instincts we've seen from any major political party, really, I think, in American history. Illiberalism has served Jews ill over the ages, and we are becoming an illiberal republic. And that should worry us deeply.
We've been touching on the issue of Israel, so let's dive in a bit. Numerous studies have shown that attachment to Israel is waning among younger American Jews. The reasons for this are complex, but we know that attachment to Israel has been a very important part of American Jewish identity for many, many decades. And support of Israel once had great unifying power for the American Jewish community, but it's quickly becoming a source of enormous division. Adding to the complications, Israel doesn't seem to need American Jewry the way it once did. What impact should the changes we are seeing regarding connection between American Jewry and Israel have on our thinking about the state of the American Jewish community? Are our best days ahead of us, or are they behind us? Bret, we'll start with you. We'll go to Pam.
Well, I think Israel's best days are ahead of it. I always feel more optimistic the moment I land in Israel and see a country that has defied every prediction and expectation of its imminent or eventual demise. And I'd like to think, by the way, again, I mean this sincerely, I want Pam to come out the winner of the argument here. I'd like to think that we too will be capable of that kind of reinvention. But it is the turn away from Israel, leaving aside the question of Israel's potential turn away from the United States, is extraordinarily worrying for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that for millions of secular-minded American Jews, Israel was the glue, Israel was the cause. Zionism was an effective and powerful and emotionally satisfying substitute for religious observance that many people found themselves leaving behind. It also says something about the nature of American Jewish emotional connections, that at the height of last year's war, so many young American Jews were eagerly signing letters denouncing Israeli behavior with nary a word to say. This was rabbinical students even, with nary a word to say about the suffering of Jews who were being sent into bunkers or into shelters because they were under massive rocket fire from a terrorist enemy that otherwise opposes everything that these liberal-minded American Jews believe in. That should have been another moment for us to worry about what has gone wrong in the American Jewish community. Now, I know this is just a segment of the American Jewish community. It's not yet the majority of it, but you feel the energy. You see it when the Harvard Crimson, which is basically a terrible newspaper, chooses, in the midst of an actual genocide in Ukraine, an actual genocide taking place in Ukraine, to decide to support BDS.
So this is great because I agree with a lot of what you just said. However, there's always a however. Decades ago, I said that the American Jewish community, in terms of its identity, was in deep trouble because it was hanging its hat, its identity, on two events external to the United States, the Holocaust and Israel. And we couldn't sustain a community that way. And the Zionist thinker, Ahad Ha'am, he thought that Israel would become this spiritual center and all the diaspora communities would circle around it. And that was never going to work. Anyone who knows anything about the way in which ethnic communities change and develop and shape their ethnicities over time knows that you can't do that from an impetus from outside. It's got to come from within. So I want to point to just 2 signs of the continuing flourishing of the American Jewish community in this golden age. Years ago, one of my friends quipped, "Where do you find all the Jews on Shabbat morning? They're davening in front of the Jewish bookshelves in their bookstores." So there, and actually in 1977, Irving Howe wrote, "American Jewish fiction has probably moved past its high point." Right? Michael Chabon, Joshua Cohen, Nicole Krauss, Dara Horn. I could name so many others. Forgive me for leaving their names off the list. But I also want to add the flowering of Jewish studies on the university campus. In 1950, at the beginning of our golden age, there were only 2 Jewish faculty teaching, Harry Wolfson at Harvard and Salo Barone at Columbia. Today, there are 1,800 members of the Association for Jewish Studies, the Learned Society for Jewish Studies faculty, and we are teaching all over the United States and actually on continents beyond the United States. The point is, and you've actually spoken publicly about this, you've spoken about how a Jewish studies professor, Leon Kass, when you were at the University of Chicago, and how he affected your understanding of what it means to be a Jew. We don't teach only Jewish students, but this is a sign of the flourishing of our golden age, and it's not diminishing.
Leon would not tell you, Leon would, I'm sure I'm speaking for him, would not tell you that this is a golden age for American academia or a golden age really for Jewish students or the Jewish students that he had. This is, first of all, I had him as a teacher 30 years ago. We're living in a new era. I just want to make a small point because I think everything you say is fair and true. But if you were to take a snapshot in time, you would also be able to say, not just in academia, but look at politics. The Senate Majority Leader is a Jew. The Chief of Staff to the President, Jewish. The Secretary of State, Jewish. The Secretary of Homeland Security, Jewish. Secretary of the Treasury, Jewish. If you were to look at that, you would say, well, how can you possibly say that this golden era is behind us? My concern is not with the present. My concern is that trends deeply embedded now are going to manifest themselves in ways that we will find difficult to reckon with just 10 or 15 years. And your kids and grandkids are sensing this, and they are seeing this, that Jewish culture, Jewish ideas, Jewish impishness, Jewish irreverence no longer accounts for the beating heart of American culture. You can go to literature, plays, theater, one thing after another. It's kind of been eclipsed. And it's been eclipsed sometimes in ways which are entirely to the good, right? We should have more Indian writers, more African-American writers, and so forth and so on. And it's also been eclipsed in ways that I think are less salutary and less hopeful. Above all, a culture of censoriousness throughout American cultural life. I don't just mean campuses, I mean publishing houses, newspapers, magazines, and so on, which hurts everyone, but particularly hurts the Jews, because we've always had this culture of second guessing, which has been so central to our identity, and which explained why Jewish culture had its zenith sometime in the middle of the 20th century, when American liberalism and Jewish values coincided for that brief and wonderful moment.
Pam?
This is, by the way, this is a debate, this is the classic Jewish debate, between it can't get much worse and yes, it can.
Right? Right. It's like, the 2 Jews, one's reading the Nazi newspaper, and it's because he reads about all the power Jews have, and the other one's reading the Jewish press, and it's saying how terrible things are.
Yeah, I know.
Exactly.
You read the Jewish press much too much.
Right, absolutely, there's no question.
We're going to turn to our last question now, and Pam, I'm going to start with you. You actually have a book on the history of Jewish American anti-Semitism coming out in 2025. So let's talk about anti-Semitism. The most concerning topic regarding the welfare of the American Jewish community in many ways. Even a mere decade ago, I think that many of us, myself included, believed that anti-Semitism was no longer really a problem for American Jews. It was kind of fading into the woodwork. It was a thing of the past. And we now see that that is far, far from the case. And while anti-Semitism on the right is typically easy to identify, anti-Semitism on the left, which is often intertwined with anti-Israel sentiment, can be much more complicated. While criticism of Israel can be legitimate, as criticism of any government can be, we have all seen where anti-Israel sentiment crosses the line into anti-Semitism through use of anti-Semitic tropes, calls for exclusion, and even violence against Jews and Zionists. What impact does rising anti-Semitism in America have on the ability of Jews to flourish in American society, whether it be in Jewish places of gathering, virtual spaces, or college campuses? Can we find reasons to be optimistic about the future?
So, I think we can find reasons to be optimistic about the future, but there's no question that the world has changed. In 2000, an academic wrote a book with the wonderful title, The Death of American Anti-Semitism. Nobody would buy into that now. But I do take heart, again, from some of these surveys. So, for example, a survey of 10,000 Americans recently about BDS found out that only 5% of Americans express any degree of support for BDS, and that 84% of adults and 83% of adults ages 18 to 29 had heard either nothing at all or not very much about BDS, and that's after about almost 20 years of a BDS barrage. So the point is, there are things that I think we can be optimistic about. I'm also somebody who understands that the world continually changes. So maybe Bret's right, and that this culture shift that we're seeing at this moment is so deeply embedded in our moment that it's going to take us into a nefarious future. I don't think the comparisons to Germany in the 1920s are fair. I don't think they're correct. I think Germany in the 1920s was a much, much more troubled place, and it was a place where people would not have said, as the Pew Research Center shows us, that the most admired religious group in the United States, according to this Pew Research Center, are the Jews. They do this warm feeling, this thermometer scale, and Jews always come out on top. So I think what we have is we have this polarization at the moment. We have rising anti-Semitism, but we have so many other signs of the continuing flourishing of our community, and this Global Forum is one of them.
Again, I hope you're right. Look, I said this earlier, but the anti-Semitism of our day is anti-Zionism. And anti-Zionism, which ought to be as every bit as disreputable as support for segregation, misogyny, any other kind of bigotry or hate, is the only, not only acceptable, but celebrated political point of view on many college campuses and increasingly in places like the United States Congress, where resolutions are being introduced on explicitly anti-Zionist basis to commemorate the Nakba and so on. So this is an insight I owe to someone in the audience, so I'm going to mention her, Pamela Peresky, who's somewhere around there. But she once pointed out to me something that was really quite interesting. Anti-Semitism is not just a bigotry. It is a conspiracy theory. It is a conspiracy theory that holds two things. One is that Jews are imposters, and the other is that they're swindlers. The anti-Semite of the late 19th century said that the European Jew merely pretends to be a German, a Frenchman, an Englishman, and so on. He's actually a Semite. He's actually from some other place. And he's a swindler. What is he trying to swindle you out of? Your patrimony, your inheritance, your culture, your nation, and one thing or another. Those were the two tenets of traditional anti-Semitism, which required in turn a political program to stop the Jews. What is anti-Zionism? It is a conspiracy theory that holds that Jews are imposters and swindlers. The anti-Zionist says that the Jew claims that he is originally, or his ancestors were originally, from the land of Israel, but they're really from Poland or Galicia or wherever, and moreover, they're swindlers. They're trying to swindle Palestinians out of their own patrimony. These are essentially identical hatreds, both conspiracy theories, both aimed at the political interests of Jews, and one of these hatreds happens to be, again, the most in vogue hatred on American college campuses. So how can you not be profoundly worried? And just one other quick point. Again, most of us, I suspect, are not going to go home tonight to Williamsburg. But many Jews are, and they're afraid. And it says something that Jews are the greatest victims in the United States today of religious hate crimes, and yet outside of this room, I doubt 1% of Americans know that.
There is so much more to say on the topic of whether the golden age of American Jewry is over. But unfortunately, it's time to turn to our closing statements. Bret, since you went second in opening remarks, why don't you give your closing statement first?
There is a paradox to pessimism. One of the reasons why Jews have been able to survive through the ages is some profoundly pessimistic instinct in our culture and our character. I didn't take the stage today simply to depress you as much as humanly possible, although that's kind of fun. I took the stage to say we need to warn ourselves. We need to revive the instinct for danger that has kept us through the ages. That is not a quote from me, it is a quote from Joachim Fest, the great German historian writing about the Germany of the 1920s and the 1930s. That's a reason to keep that horrible analogy in mind, not to simply allow it to happen again, to make sure it never happens again.
Thank you.
Well, once again, we agree on a lot of things except for the conclusion. The perception that our golden age has ended rests on the rising anti-Semitism, and I would include anti-Zionism of our day. But the golden age of Sephardic Jewry also had terrible episodes of anti-Semitism. Maimonides, its towering figure, had to flee Cordova after a fundamentalist Islamic regime conquered his birthplace and forced Jews and Christians to convert. And his family went into exile, first to North Africa and then over into Egypt. At one point, Maimonides said, "I have not attained the learning of my forebears, for evil days and hard times have overtaken us, and we have not lived in tranquility." We don't live in tranquility in America again, yet the religious, the political, the cultural, and the intellectual vibrancy of our American Jewish community of the past 3/4 of a century, I believe, is going to continue despite anti-Semitism, which so often has a paradoxical effect of both strengthening Jewish identity as well as damaging it.
I want to thank Dr. Pamela Nadell and Bret Stephens for their insight and their wisdom, not to mention their excellent arguing skills this morning. We live in times when it often seems it's impossible to have a civil debate. Pam and Bret, today you not only gave us much to think about as we continue to monitor and protect the health of our beloved American Jewish community, but you also modeled what it means to carry out a debate with civility and purpose, what the rabbis called a machloket l'shem shamayim, an argument for the sake of heaven. One thing is for sure, we know that both of you join AJC and everyone in this room in hoping for and working for a vibrant, cohesive, safe, and connected American Jewish community for the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who wishes to support JBS with a tax-deductible gift of $36, double high or more. Simply visit the JBS website at jbstv.org and click on the Donate button to make a donation by PayPal or your credit card. And please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD. Or you can send your tax-deductible check to JBS, Post Office Box 360, Stamford, Connecticut 06904. Or you can call the JBS Pledge Line at 833-MY-JBS-TV. That's 833-695-2788. And again, please remember to indicate which program you would like to receive with our compliments. We thank you for your kind support.